I'm inspired to dance after having seen that performance, but the last time I danced in public was my bar mitzvah, and there's been no demand since then for me to dance. When our country was created, there was a feeling that we should have a performing arts be part of it, and the arts be part of it. And actually, in the original design for the city of Washington, Pierre L'Enfant, hired by George Washington, actually created a national cultural center. And it was part of the original design. And it was Pierre L'Enfant's view that how could you have a city like Washington be a grand city like London and Paris, which was George Washington's view, if you don't actually have a cultural center there. And so it was put right in there, and actually was put on the Grand Avenue, now called Pennsylvania Avenue. But Pierre L'Enfant got fired, and we ran out of money, and we were barely able to build the city, so it got pushed aside, as often happens, unfortunately, with the arts, it gets pushed aside. And so it didn't happen. And so we didn't really have a performing arts center for quite some time, and many other theaters arose. They were built by entrepreneurs. The most famous of them, of course, is Ford's Theater. And then eventually in the 1930s, 1940s, Eleanor Roosevelt really pushed to have a national cultural center, a national performing arts center. And finally, in 1958, legislation was signed by President Eisenhower, who also was a supporter, to build a performing arts center in Washington, and it would be the National Cultural Center, as it was called. It was supposed to be funded only by private sector money. So from 1958 through 1961, when President Kennedy took office, a total of $13,000 was raised. Not enough to build a performing arts center. So President Kennedy decided he would really do something about it. And in talking about it, he said we need to have this because the truth is when civilization the history is past, what people will remember more about our civilization is not what victories or defeats we have in politics or in battle, but really what the spirit of our civilization is all about. And so we need to have a national cultural center. And he really brought down a man from New York, Roger Stevens, who began national telethons to raise money. And in fact, recently Yo-Yo Ma pointed out that he was actually participating in one as a 7 or 8-year-old boy. And they raised about $1 million in one of the telethons. Unfortunately, they didn't really raise enough to get it done. And then when President Kennedy was assassinated, his family, because of his commitment to this area, decided that the appropriate way to memorialize President Kennedy through a living memorial was to build the Kennedy Center, as it was later called, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. It actually cost about $70 million to build. $35 million came from the government, and $35 million from private citizens around the world. And today, we are a performing arts center and an arts education center. When I think back on it, what President Kennedy wanted to do was something that the founders of our country really wanted to do. And as I visualize it, and the way I look at it, I just like you to think about this. President Kennedy made a speech in May of 1961 before the joint session of Congress. And he said, I want to challenge Americans to get to the moon before the end of this century, before this end of this decade. And you all know we did in 1969. We landed 2 men on the moon. And before that, though, that was Apollo 11. Some of you may remember that. But there was a previous voyage to the moon to see whether we could actually get to the moon and back, and it was called Apollo 8. Jim Lovell was in that, and Frank Borman was in that mission as well. And some of you may be old enough to remember this. It was the first time that man had left the orbit of the Earth and was heading to the orbit of another body. And when they got to the moon, they circled around the back of the moon, and no one had ever seen the backside of the moon. No one knew whether they would come back from the backside of the moon. And after circling around this 4 times, they circled 10 times before they came back to Earth. On the 4th time around, on Christmas Day in 1968, they saw for the first time what the Earth looked like in space. They saw the first Earthrise, and the first time anybody had ever seen, any human had ever seen what Earth looked like. And Jim Lovell took pictures of it, and others took pictures of it. And you may recall that on that inspirational time, they began to read from the Bible. They said, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And clearly, for the first time, humans had seen Earth, what God had created from this perspective. And when Jim Lovell was looking at it, you may remember from seeing the movie Apollo 13, he put his thumb up and he kind of said, wow, isn't it interesting? I have the entire Earth, all of civilization, everything we've created, really so small that it's behind my thumb. And when you think about it, what God created in the heaven and earth in 6 days, really, and then he rested on the seventh, is a pretty impressive thing. He had no authorizing committees, he had no appropriation committees he had to deal with. So it was, impressive to do that. Had he had authorizing and appropriating committees to deal with, he probably would have taken a few years to get it done. But he did it in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And when you think back on what did God do that was so amazing, what did he create? Well, the most amazing thing he put on the earth, in my view, was the human brain. You think about all the things on the face of the earth, all the great things that are here, what is the most amazing thing? It's the human brain. Because this organ is able to create culture, civilization, all the things that humans have created in the thousands of years that we've really had civilization. And when you think about it, one of the most important things that all of us care about is the thing that the human brain has done, which is to create art and performing arts, visual arts, literature, all the kinds of things that make civilization so important and make life so enjoyable. And what distinguishes us from animals on the earth? Well, we've created a culture because we've used our brain to be able to do things that elevate the human spirit. And that's what really makes culture so important. And actually, when our country was founded, the people who founded our country, they didn't see politics here and economics here and culture here. They saw people having everything together. And so the founding fathers were not people who viewed arts as off to the side, something that would be dealt with as an addendum to something else, something whose budget could be cut when no other money was available for things. They would just cut the budget of arts. They didn't look at it that way. They viewed that arts was an essential part of one's DNA. So as Balder knows, Benjamin Franklin, important thing among other things he did was play music. It was very important to him. In fact, he created his own musical instrument for which Mozart and Beethoven composed pieces. George Washington, known as an austere military general, well, the great love of his life was actually going to shows, going to operas. And in fact, the greatest gift that he could give to people, he thought, was giving them a ticket to see a show. And in fact, he loved dancing. He might not have been able to do what we just saw, but he was famous as a dancer. In fact, so famous his wife may not have been as happy about it all the time because he tended to dance with very young ladies many times for 1 or 2 hours at a time. He was quite an indefatigable dancer. And then there is Thomas Jefferson. There is no one quite like him. President Kennedy famously said in a dinner when all the Nobel Prize winners who in the United States had gathered once that there had not been so much talent in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And why did he say that? He said that because Thomas Jefferson was a vintner, he was a bibliophile, he was an agronomist, he was an artist, he was an architect, and he was a musician. And Thomas Jefferson would say the greatest pleasure of his life was playing music. As a young boy, he practiced violin 3 hours a day. And when he was wooing his wife, Martha, he spent much of the time doing it by playing the violin. She played the harpsichord. And one time, when some other men who wanted to woo her as well came to her house, they heard him playing the violin and her playing the harpsichord, and it was so beautiful, and they were singing as well, they realized their chance of wooing her was gone, and they left. It is said by Thomas Jefferson's grandchildren that the greatest things that he used to do and the greatest pleasure was when he taught them music, and he insisted his own children learn how to play music. And whenever he was riding, whenever he was walking, he was singing. He didn't just walk in solitary by himself, he was singing. And he often did enormous amounts of things to make other people understand the beauty of music. Now, it's probably unrealistic that we're going to have another Thomas Jefferson be elected President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson probably couldn't be elected President of the United States today. For all of his talents and brilliance, he had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, and he virtually never talked in public. In fact, in 8 years as president, he only made one public speech. He was a little shy in that way, but he was great in other respects. But while we're not likely to have another Thomas Jefferson, we can have leaders, I think, who care about the arts and care about culture, who recognize that this country is dependent on and really founded by people who care about the arts, and we shouldn't shunt the arts aside. Now, recently I made some remarks at a place called Ilogy Memorial. It's a memorial to the Marine Corps in our country for people who've fallen in combat. have given the last full measure of devotion, as Lincoln would say. And those people who give their lives for our country clearly are patriots. And those people who are political leaders are clearly patriots as well in many cases. But those of you who fight for culture are, in my view, cultural patriots. And I think that all of you here and all those around the country who fight to make sure people understand the importance of arts and culture are as patriotic as the people who serve in our military or people who serve in our government. So I want to thank all of you for what you are doing to help make sure people in the United States recognize that we aren't a country where you can separate the culture from the politics and economics. Everything is together. It's part of our DNA. And if we're going to be a great country and we're going to have a country that civilization will remark upon about how great it is centuries from now, it has to be one where our culture is featured. And so we have to promote young artists. We have to educate people who are not artists, but educate them about the value of arts. Let me just conclude by saying something that I'd like to quote President Kennedy about. President Kennedy, in his famous inaugural address, some of you may remember this, in 1961 on January 20th, he gave a speech that was the greatest speech he ever gave, and he said in about this 14 minutes, of course, the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And I think all of you are doing that as well when you're helping your country by promoting the cultural arts and the civilization that is so important to our society. But at the end of that speech, he said, "With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." What I think you're doing to help promote culture is really God's work on earth, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Kennedy Center for everything you're doing, and thank you for being here. Thank you.